Hello, and thank you for joining us on Vermont Film Essentials. My name is David Metzger.
And I'm Lincoln L. Hayes. This week we'll be talking about Akira Kurosawa's RASHOMON from 1950. But before we do that, programming note. So the release schedule for the show is changing just a little bit. We shoot the show on Tuesdays to release the next Wednesday. So that will stay the same for YouTube and Facebook. But for Channel 15, the channel where we live, will be the week after that. So it'll be 2 weeks after we record. So there you go. Sorry for the confusion, but that'll be our schedule going forward. So just keep an eye on our social media, and if you do watch on the channel, just know that we're a week behind. So RASHOMON.
RASHOMON.
Why did you add it onto the schedule this season?
I think with Rear Window, we discussed how that film is like the cinematic textbook opened up, and Hitchcock uses every tool that he has in his cinematic toolbox for that film to discuss voyeurism, what the camera does, what the camera sees. With Dog Day Afternoon, we discussed about how like the theme dictates everything that the film is doing. So what the camera is doing, what the costumes do, how he uses music. With RASHOMON, it feels like that same type of exercise in cinematic technique. So for the first time, he's using editing and perspectives and cinematography in very innovative ways to express a thematic idea. And the first time you see it, it's weird because you watch it and you can see everything that it is influenced. And there's even, it's coined a phrase, the RASHOMON effect. Anytime somebody is making a film or doing a story where he's considering different perspectives or different points of view, he says that it's very RASHOMON-like. So it's a film that you definitely watch, and sometimes it's hard because you can't get past the fact that I've seen this is like that thing, or this is like that thing that I watched. But it still has a very everlasting effect to it. And in particular, just the way he shoots it, the way the cinematography still looks modern. Yeah.
This is 70 years ago almost. And it's one of the first uses of handheld cameras in 1950. That's crazy town.
And just like, things like shooting the camera directly at the sun.
Never been done before.
Never been done before.
Yeah.
And even to the point where it's like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah. You will break something.
Right.
And you're like, let's try it.
Yeah.
And then you have that beautiful shot through the trees that is her perspective during the attack. And you're like, oh, that shot.
And that is almost, that's like that's in the indie film textbook. Like, if you're making an indie film, have a shot with the sun.
Yeah, or the moon, or something. Yeah. This was my first viewing of it because I have never had access to it, but I've known the title forever. I had no idea what it was about. Going in, even Rachel was like, "What is RASHOMON about?" And I was like, "I don't know, but I'm gonna watch it." And I really enjoyed it. I was a little confused, but so were the cast apparently. During the filming of it, I read that the cast approached Kurosawa during the production, was like, what does this mean? What is it about? And he responded, it's a reflection of life, and life does not always have clear meaning. It's like, oh, is that a cop-out? And it's accurate, because you watch it and it's like, well, we have 3 different perspectives here. Well, four. Really. Yeah. And we have the unreliable narrator. Who do we trust? Who's right? Who's wrong? Whose story is accurate? And as you watch each of them, plead their case and say what happened, the truth of the matter is that a man is dead at the hands of another man. So there it is. Murder. Or is it?
Right.
And that's the question that you keep asking throughout. You're like, all right, well, this is how it happened. And then you hear another perspective and you're like, maybe it did happen this way. And then the more you hear and the more you hear, the more confused you are by the end of it. And you're just like, I don't know. I don't know what happened. And even now, I don't know. Because are we to believe that the guy who didn't tell the full story actually killed him?
Right.
Who's to say?
And that's why, like, I think it's the ultimate cafe movie where you watch the movie and then you go out to the cafe afterwards and you discuss it.
Yeah.
And much like the movie begins with 3 people sitting there being like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, just tell me about it.
Okay.
You would just be rehashing what you had just watched.
Right.
And that is really what the movie is about, is not, I think if this was a film where it was like, a puzzle film or a traditional mystery film where it's like you need to figure out who the killer is,
right.
and at the end the killer is revealed. Sure, you'd get the satisfaction of knowing the truth and knowing who did it, and being able to say like, oh, I knew it. But I don't think you would be discussing it in quite the way that we are able to discuss it now.
Because somebody would put on their nerd glasses and say, well, I knew it was so-and-so from the beginning because such and such. Whereas this one, during the wife's testimony, I was like, oh, she did it. Because I don't believe her for a second. She's putting on such a show, and none of this seems honest. But then maybe not. Maybe it was the other way. Maybe it was the second bandit's way that happened. And,
And is it that, does everyone just have their own idea of the truth?
Right.
Based on whatever it was that they experienced. And you can watch each section or each story and say, well, from their point of view, I understand why they're telling it this way, or why they're spinning it this way. Right? To protect something about themselves or something about whatever, their ego or whatever.
Exactly.
Like, so the bandit's telling his version of the story.
Which is very macho.
Right, so that he still is a bandit. The husband's telling his version of the story, and it's, so that he can be the stoic male
samurai
husband and samurai.
Yeah. Which that was very interesting, to have his story told through a medium who is speaking in his voice.
Right.
That is pretty revolutionary.
Right, and it's weird because you watch this film and you're like, oh, it's very realistic, and you would think something like that would just
take you out of it completely.
Crumble the realism that you're going for. But somehow it doesn't, and it feels it's creepy, and you can watch it and you can be like, well, I don't believe this because I don't believe in this idea.
Yeah.
So you can just disregard it if you want. What is very interesting about this film and the way that it is shot, just speaking from a cinematography point of view, is so there's two different visual planes. So there is the reality of the court,
which is also interesting that we don't see the court.
We don't. We see
or hear them.
We are the court.
Yeah.
We're the jury.
Yeah.
And we get to listen to it being told to us, and we get to say, not that one, this one. This one.
I mean, if I were on the jury, I'd say that's a hung jury right there, because I have reasonable doubt all over the place. No one convinced me. It
would be funny to watch, like, a great double feature would be this film and then 12 Angry Men.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
But from a cinematography point of view, so the court is you can tell that it's a set. It's very sparse. There's not a lot going on.
Just gravel and a wall.
Yep.
Pretty
and
much.
You can tell. You can from one perspective, you can say, okay, it was a low budget film, so he did what he could with the budget that he had.
Yeah.
But then you can look at it another way and say, no, this is just a simple tableau, and that works for what it is. It's just
don't overcomplicate it.
Right. Then you have the RASHOMON gate that is just drenched in the rain and the downpour.
Forever and ever.
And then you have the woods. Now, the woods is very natural. So it's not a set. It's just they went out into the woods and they did that. The one thing that they did do was that they had to Because they were deep in the woods, they had to add lighting. They had to do that very carefully because they needed to use the sun coming through the leaves and make sure that they're maintaining that visual idea. Because that ties into the theme of, okay, well, if the sun is an absolute truth, the leaves is all of our different perspectives getting in the way of that, and the sun is trying to pierce its way through that. The truth is trying to pierce its way through that.
Right.
So rain to block the sun, the clouds, and they're just swimming in doubt, and they have no idea, like they just don't understand. One of the great opening lines of any movie is, I just don't understand.
When I put the DVD in, it was the English translation was on, but it still had the subtitles on, and the dubbing didn't match the subtitles. I was so confused for a second because that's the first time that's happened. Normally it just plays in the native language. It was just like, what, whoa, wait, stop it, play right.
Which is crazy because you think of how many people who watch a dubbed version and just lose so much because it's poor dubbing.
Yeah. It's so, I mean, it's close enough.
Right.
But you look at it and compare me, like, there's that one point where he talks about like war, earthquake, and wind, but in the dubbed version he says hurricane. I was like, I mean, no, it's not the same. Anyway.
But yeah, just photographically using the theme, like taking, just like we talked about with Sidney Lumet. You have a theme, you have an idea of what you're trying to say about truth and justice, and different perspectives of the truth. And then you just spin from that, and you have your visual cues and your visual ideas. And this film lays it out for you the whole time. And using the symbolism of the sun and the rain and the court of you playing the role of the jury and listening to all these different perspectives. And at the end, being just as confused as they are. Yeah. Being just as distraught, or, you know, like the priest, he's just, I've lost all faith in mankind. Yeah. And there's a someone wrote an essay about how this could be read as a interpretation of after World War II. And
I can see that for sure.
And what is great about this film is that in a film where whatever the event is, we see the event, whatever the outcome is, whatever the truth of it is, doesn't really matter. So that event then can become whatever you want it to be. Yeah. So if you want to talk about a war, or, like we've been seeing, any film we pick tends to make us think about what's going on right now. And there's so many things that are going on right now where we're like, I don't know about humanity right now.
Yeah, it's questionable.
But then there's something that can happen that can not change your mind or change your perspective about whatever the event is that made you lose your faith in humanity to begin with. But there's something that can happen that can at least restore it just a little bit, so you can say, okay, I can keep going because of this. And that's what the ultimate ending of this film means to me, and it has been criticized as being a cop-out or overly sentimental, or just an easy way to not tell you the truth, but to not leave you in despair, which would be seen as being the more accurate ending.
Yeah, and it's a perfectly fine ending because we don't know. So rather than not knowing, this is okay. I'm gonna take this. Right. This I understand. This works. I get it. It works perfectly. It feels almost like Waiting for Godot in a way, because we have these people sitting around waiting for the rain to stop, talking to each other, just telling the same story from a different perspective. and we don't ever really go anywhere. Like if without the flashbacks, this would be a 10-minute movie of them telling the story.
Right.
And then they'd be like, is that what happened? It's like, I think so. And then they tell a different version of the story. Like, well, that's different from his. And then they tell a different version. And then you're just like, well, what's the truth? And they're like, I don't know. Oh, the rain stopped. I'm going to go.
Right. And just like we discussed with Rear Window, you would think a film about a person in one room
Wouldn't work.
Wouldn't work and would be the least cinematic thing you could see.
And yet it's Rear Window.
Yet it's Rear Window, and yet this is Rashomon. Like
Yeah.
there's a poetry to his images. Even the openings when they're just sitting there in that rain-drenched gate, it looks just so stunning. And it is, yeah, it's just three people sitting around talking in one location. But man, he knows how to make it look cinematic.
And then the first time we see the woods with the couple coming down and she's on the horse with the long veil, the first thing I wrote was stunning. It's beautiful imagery. I almost wish it could be colorized, because I bet those scenes in the woods are just so vibrant and so gorgeous. Also, the orchestration in this movie is beautiful. There's some gorgeous music in this. There are a few times I noticed early in the film that it almost seemed to be suggesting an emotional response, like a little borderline schmaltzy. But then I also remembered that it was part of somebody's narrative.
Right.
So they were probably influencing the narrative a little bit, and
Right.
that's part of the orchestration. It was mostly when the bandit is telling his version that I was like, this music seems a little bouncy and upbeat, but he is.
Right.
He's a very animated, over-the-top character. I also read that a lot of the work that he did for the character was studying the movement and behavior of lions. And knowing that, you can see that. You can see his animal work that he's doing for this character, and it is so good.
Right.
He's incredible.
Yeah.
In every vignette, too. I'm glad we start with his, so we can get how big he is right out of the gate, both from his testimony to the court and then his telling of the story. Because I think if it had been structured differently and he were later, he would seem too big and too over-animated. But having him tell his testimony first gets that out there. It's like, okay, this guy's just a big character. Got it.
Yep.
And it works so well.
And so this is Toshiro Mifune is the one that plays the bandit, and we discussed him when we discussed Seven Samurai. But he's definitely Kurosawa's, alter ego, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
Uses him a lot, and yeah, like he finds the right note for every character that he plays. And especially in this one, like he's just, he's not a good guy.
No.
He's not a good person. And
there's no doubt about that either.
Right.
It's just how bad of a person is he? Because first and foremost, he rapes this woman. Like, crime number one. And then the murders after that, but he's still. And then he's like, oh, normally I would just be with a woman, move on, but for some reason I was drawn to her. And it's just like, that doesn't make it better.
right.
No, it's still awful what you did.
And I think like it's such heavy, harsh material even for 1950.
Oh, yeah.
So it's amazing that he's able to get that in. But then
It's never said.
Never.
It's never outright said.
But even like just like when you're going through the different perspectives of the story and how each person reacts to just that one awful thing is just so layered and harsh. Like how the husband responds to that.
Right.
Like it just blew me away for a film made in 1950 to be able to say that. And even like, so Kurosawa has always been known for overstating his love of John Ford. And kind of similar to how in America, John Ford was always criticized for being sentimental sometimes, or always having a comic relief in his more harsh, more heavy material. So Kurosawa in Japan, it's very interesting to note that this film was not loved in Japan.
Seven Samurai wasn't initially either, was it?
So he was always a director that was criticized for being, like you said, that his performance of Studying Lions is and some of the music being very big and operatic. And he was a director that wanted to be operatic and thought of his films as opera. But that wasn't, it was criticized in Japan for being a little kabuki. And for being very, not being realistic enough, or not being, one of his competitors at this time was a director called Ozu, and his films were very, very subdued, very subtle, very realistic, as opposed to this. But in America, I mean, that was just, yes,
that's how we did it.
This. So, I mean, this film became one of the biggest Japanese releases ever. It opened the doors for foreign cinema in America. It won the Best Foreign Language Award. I think it won some like the Golden Lion or something at Venice.
First prize,
and like those types of things, it's like, geez, like that the film wasn't loved in its native country, but everywhere else it was just like adored.
That's got to be difficult as Kurosawa,
right? To
be like, or like, it's like kind of like a David Hasselhoff kind of thing, where like he's huge in Germany, and he's a joke here. It's gotta suck, because you're like, I made this movie, everyone.
Right.
It's about our culture, and it's about our 11th century, everything, and everybody's like, like, really? And then America, they're like, yes, we want this, and you're like,
see,
okay, well, I guess I'll go to America. But then I'm glad he didn't, because so often that happens where people get pulled in by Hollywood, and then they come to Hollywood, and then they just make crap. And they're like, well, this is what they paid me to make. And it's like, no, you need to stay where you are, make the stories that you want to be making, and Hollywood will be there. If they want more, they'll ask for it. But don't just up and go, because then you're going to lose that part of yourself that makes you so great. So remember that. Hollywood may be calling, but you don't have to answer. I don't know who I'm talking
to. So just a little bit about the editing of this film, because it is, I think if you're going to take one cinematic idea from this film, it's the editing. Two things. One, this film is a brisk 88 minutes. Doesn't need to be longer. I had the same reaction when you're watching, Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan's new film. What I loved about it was that it just starts. It just starts.
We're there.
You're in it. There's no backstory. There's no, here's what's going on. It's just, boom, you're in it.
Let's go.
And for, the shortest film he's ever made, at 100 minutes, it is that breakneck pace the whole way. And it's similar to, it's this. It's like, let's break this film down to its essentials.
It's film essentials.
I did it again. And let's make it as simple as possible. Let's get our ideas across. Let's not hammer people over the head. Let's just make our points and move. And at 88 minutes, this film has the power of a 3-hour film. And, he had, I'll find it, a great quote about that.
While you're looking that up, it has a bit of a feeling of To Kill a Mockingbird to me as well, of just like this kind of procedural feel to it that involves a bunch of different perspectives and narratives. And in the end, we have an idea of truth, but we don't have absolute truth. And I think that that's really kind of powerful for a film of A, this length, and this material as well. Because when you walk away from it, you don't know, and you're just like, awful things happen, but I don't know who's to blame and who should be punished. And obviously the bandit should be punished because he did it all, but the motivations thereof,
Right.
yeah.
So Kurosawa said he felt that sound cinema multiplies the complexity of a film. Cinematic sound is never merely accompaniment, never merely what the sound machine caught while you took the scene. Real sound does not merely add to the images, it multiplies it. Regarding Rashomon, Kurosawa said, I like silent pictures and I always have. I wanted to restore some of this beauty. I thought of it, I remember, in this way. One of the techniques of modern art is simplification, and that I must therefore simplify this film. And he absolutely does. And he just, whatever dialogue needs to be said, it says it, moves right on. And just like with Dunkirk, it's all imagery and the power of sound and the power of what you're seeing. And it's just, it's amazing. You always feel like if this film needs to be important or needs to get coined that phrase epic, it needs to be big and it needs to be long and it needs to take
6
all these
hours.
big, broad strokes. But then you see a film like this and you're like, there's a power to being as concise and tight as possible.
The performances across the board are excellent. They're very specific. Everybody, has depth and has life to who they're playing, from the priest to having a tremendous crisis of faith throughout. Like, until the end, he still is just so conflicted by everything. The bandit has so much specificity to what he's doing, besides his animal work, all of his little ticks, the way that he scratches, and the way that he always hits the bugs off of him and stuff like that. And in his vignette, when he approaches them, he does it like an animal. Like, he comes up and he squats down next to him, and he is showing him the sword, and he's like, oh, I found this over there, I'll sell it to you if you want. And doing whatever he can to stay in control of the situation, to then be completely out of control when we have the wife's perspective, when he and the samurai are afraid to fight each other. That scene was hilarious, but also incredible, that she's able to get these two men so riled up that they can't even fight. And when they do fight, it's sloppy, it's all over the place, and for a samurai, he looks like he's never held a sword before.
Right.
So that's when you're like, I don't know if I trust this perspective, because he's supposed to be a master swordsman.
Right.
Her performance in all the vignettes is excellent as well. She's definitely, the damsel in distress in the bandit version. Then she, tries to take control and be powerful in her own vignette. And then the median, for such a small role, that's just, you're just here to function as a body so we can dub you. And like you said, when you introduce that into the story, you can very easily dismiss it and be like, that doesn't fit in this world. But he sets it up so well that when they're having the conversation, they're like, well, then we had heard his story. And he's like, whoa, 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 whoa. How can you hear his story? He's dead. And he's like, well, he spoke through a medium. And then we just cut right to her shaking the stick, calling forth the spirit or whatever. And you're like, okay, we're really doing this. We're actually going to hear a medium, I should say, tell his story. And then as soon as she starts to speak, it's in his voice. And you're like, this is for real. We're doing this. Okay. And then, that's obviously taken with a grain of salt, because it's a medium speaking for a spirit who was dead.
Right.
So let's just disregard that testimony, unfortunately. And then even the bandit who questionably may have murdered him in the end. He's so conflicted. He's so distraught over all of this, start to finish. And then the one thing, I was a little bit confused with the baby. So what's going on with the baby? Who left the baby? He's taking the baby to make up for lying.
So, yeah, the baby was abandoned, so he's taking the baby to raise himself with his 6 children.
Right.
As an act of good faith for what he feels like he's done.
Right.
He never says it, but the commoner who's listening to his story finds him out and is like, you know, you stole, is that amulet?
The dagger. Yeah.
The dagger, yeah. And it's like, you stole the dagger, and that's why you didn't speak up, because you didn't want to be
That's
found
what
out.
it was. He stole from them.
Yeah.
Got it. I was confused that he might have been the killer, because he comes upon the dead samurai's body in his version of it and then just runs away. And there's no mention of a dagger or anything in his story,
Right.
but there is in the other stories.
Right.
So those pieces don't add up either.
And
So
that's the
that makes more
thing, it's
sense.
like, you know, he takes the dagger. That's why he doesn't speak up. That's why he doesn't tell the whole truth, because he did steal the dagger. He didn't want to be found out. He's called out on that by the commoner. And then when the priest is holding the baby, the woodcutter comes up and says, you know,
I'll take it.
Yeah, and he's just like, no, I don't trust you, and I don't trust where. But then he pleads his case, and no, he's going to raise it with his 6 children. This is what he's going to do, and that is what, in turn, restores his faith in humanity. Of, you know, there is still a little bit of good here, and even though he did this bad thing and he took this dagger, heart was sort of in the right place. Because
Let's have a little perspective.
Right.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense now. Let's see, do I have...
And then at the end, that closing shot of him walking away with the baby, again, symbolically, that's when the sun comes out. And,
That's when we restore hope.
yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the light in the woods and how they were able to do that. They shot in the actual woods. They tried to shoot in midday so they'd have the best light, but it was just so dense that they couldn't, even with the bounce boards, the like foil reflective boards that you use for filmmaking, they couldn't get the light they needed. So they used mirrors. And I noticed it in one of the vignettes. It's a shot of the wife and the bandit. She's in the foreground and he's kind of in the background. And he approaches her. She's upset and crying. But just the way that the light hits him, it's a little too rectangular. And I was like, there we go. There's the mirrors. But nobody had ever done that before.
Right.
I mean, it's another revolutionary thing that he did out of necessity. And you're like, oh yeah, you could use mirrors. That makes sense. No one had ever thought of it at that point. And similarly to Seven Samurai, where it was freezing rain when they did the big fight scene and everybody, like, didn't somebody lose toes? I got frostbite or something. In this one, the rain wasn't showing up as clearly as he wanted to, so they added some ink into the rain reservoir so that it would contrast a little bit. And you can notice it a little bit in near the end when the commoner and the woodcutter are going toe-to-toe and they go out into the rain. They get a little bit of ink on their faces from the rainwater. And this film was actually often credited as the reason that there is a best foreign language film category for the Oscars now, because of this movie. They were like, well, we need to recognize international cinema. What does that say? Oh, yeah. That's my trivia.
It's amazing how much if this film is the first film that kind of ushered in that whole, like you said, recognizing foreign cinema. You know, he was one of the first foreign directors who became a household name, along with Bergman, because 6 years later, he makes Seventh Seal, and that becomes just, you know, the next big craze in terms of foreign cinema. And Bergman was influenced by Kurosawa, and you know, but in speaking about influence, because you know, when you saw this film and seeing those different perspectives, like, did you have that thought of, I've seen this before?
Yes.
and just trying to figure out of like, you know, how many stories have we seen told similarly to this? You know, even in the news and other media, you know, two off the top of my head is just, so there's Courage Under Fire with Denzel Washington, Meg Ryan. Similar thing where it's a war incident and it's told with different perspectives. There's The Social Network, where we're getting two sides of the same story, and we're seeing it, well, three sides really.
Yeah.
Did you ever see the movie Waltz with Bashir?
No.
So Ari Foreman, so he is a Israeli filmmaker, and he is making a story about the war, and it's basically a film about him. He was in the war, so he's going back kind of like as a journalist and just asking some of his soldiers about an incident that happened back in the war. And he has these images in his head, and he's got these reoccurring things that he has, like PTSD stuff, and he's just trying to figure out the whole story as to where this came from, or if it was just a vision, or if it's something that actually happened. And kind of similar to this, like he's talking to a couple of different people, and he's getting pieces from each one, and different sides of the story from each one. So, you know, this film just, again, it's just one of those movies where you watch it and you can, it's like watching the history of cinema in one film.
Yeah.
Kind of like Citizen Kane, kind of like, you know, even something like Seven Samurai, where you're watching it and you're just like, wow, I see everything that this
film and that film and that film and this one and that one, yeah. And also watching it, because of the simplicity of the story and the way that the storytelling is done, you could very easily brainstorm remakes, reboots, influenced by stories, where, and the one that actually keeps coming to mind for me is Identity, the John Cusack movie, where it's a couple different stories, a couple different ways, and then they overlap each other a little bit, and a little bit like Pulp Fiction too, where storyline A is happening while storyline C is also happening, and then here comes storyline B that matches up with the beginning of C and then overlaps a little of A. And it is also interesting, and I know in Pulp Fiction at least, it's a mistake in continuity that some of the dialogue is different.
Right.
But it almost plays into that idea of, well, this is from someone else's perspective, they may have heard it differently.
Right.
Or they may misremember it, or maybe the person telling it the first time doesn't remember it accurately and the second person does. And not to make it political, but it's what's going on right now with this whole comment about other countries from the man in the White House right now, where he said, she said.
Right.
Sadly, that's real life. This is a film. This is to be enjoyed. That's the nature of our world right now. But, I mean, it still happens. It's all this, I didn't say that, I didn't say it that way, that's not how I remember it, oh, I don't recall, blah, 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 blah. And it's a timeless story of what really happened. What is the actual truth? We don't know. Nobody knows. And it doesn't help either that we have a dead guy, but we have the storytelling device of a medium to be able to still tell his story.
Right.
Because it's you know, that old adage in any kind of murder trial, it's like, if only we could ask the victim what happened, then we would have the accurate story. But then, would it be accurate? Because then it's from their perspective, they're in a heightened emotional state, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
There's a lot of layers to this, and anybody who enjoys true crime, or is like an avid, you know, listener of something like My Favorite Murder, this movie's actually kind of right up your alley, because it's what it is. It's a bunch of different perspectives on a murder that happened.
Right. And
if you had told me that going into it, oh, this is like a 11th century Japanese true crime story, I'm like, what? How does that work?
Right.
That's Rashomon. It works. And I can definitely see why this is a film that people still talk about and people still think about when they write and make their own films. because it's simplicity and it's perfection. He nailed it.
Mm-hmm. I feel like if this is like if the modern interpretation of this, it wouldn't be the medium. It would be a journalist, or it would be reading texts or emails.
Yeah. Or
it
somebody,
would be
the
fire
recorder
and
was
fury.
the recorder was on somebody's phone or something, and we have this piece of audio,
and we can piece this together with a couple of different things that we have as well.
and there's CCTV footage, and we cobble those together, and we get an idea. I mean, we were talking about Black Mirror before we started rolling, and there could be a Black Mirror episode that is Rashomon, of people just trying, and there is actually in the most recent season. That's crazy.
Honey, we're going to have something awesome to watch.
Oh, that makes that episode so much better in my mind now, because at first I was like, it's fine, but it's, you guys, most recent season, the one that's set in Iceland, it's Rashomon. Holy crap.
He just got that.
Wow.
Now I can't wait to watch that episode. We got to breeze through season 3 now.
No, don't. Take your time. This is not a, Black Mirror is not a binge-watchy show. It's watch one and then cry for a while. Oh. What are some other Kurosawa films that are of note? We've covered 2, and they're the big 2, as far as I know. But if anybody really wants to dive in to his filmography, what are some other films that they should look for?
So we got Seven Samurai, we got Rashomon. There's a film called Redbeard. There's Yojimbo, which became A Fistful of Dollars.
Right.
To the point where, so Clint Eastwood received the script for A Fistful of Dollars by Sergio Leone. And he read it, and Sergio was like, so what did you think? And he's like, yeah, I get this. It's Yojimbo. He's like, good on you. And,
you did it.
So Yojimbo is one to watch, especially if you like those Man with No Name, the trilogy from Sergio Leone. Well, Ron was one of his recent ones, and that is basically King Lear. I think those are the big ones. Throne of Blood.
Yeah, I remember talking about that one.
The Hidden Fortress was big because George Lucas definitely watched that, and you can watch that and you can see where C-3PO and R2-D2 came from.
Score. Yeah.
But if you happen to subscribe to Filmstruck and the Criterion channel, you can look up Akira Kurosawa, and you have a whole list of films that you can go through.
Thanks, Filmstruck. Would you like to sponsor us?
Free subscription.
Please, please, please. And his influence is everywhere. George Lucas, Sergio Leone, Quentin Tarantino, Edgar Wright, obviously, and pretty much anybody who's telling this kind of story with this kind of scope is influenced by his films. And they just permeate throughout cinema, from cinematography and cinematography techniques and the way that he moves the camera and uses the camera, to lighting and script writing, and just like what you were saying about the brisk pace of this screenplay. Couldn't be very long. It's all exposition and description, because there's very little dialogue in any of the scenes, and a lot of it almost feels improvised. Where they're just out in the woods, and he's like, all right, well, go at each other with swords, and then whatever happens, happens.
What's also interesting is this is one of the first cases of a film, a scene being shot with multiple cameras, and he did that specifically during the scene in the woods, so that he could edit between different perspectives and see different things at different times, but also so that he could just roll the cameras and just have them go through it, so that it would feel like a real life event. That was just taking
Didn't
place
feel
in his
stagey
camera.
and piece by piece by piece by piece by piece. I prefer that style of filmmaking, and I think it's coming from a theater background of let's just go through the scene and we'll get what we get, and then we'll go back and pick up the pieces that we don't have.
Right.
And that, as a performer, that always works better for me too, because then you have your emotional arc from the beginning to the end of the scene, instead of I'm going to yell at you, and then 2 days from now you're going to respond to me in your coverage. That style of filmmaking to me has always seemed ineffective and not very time efficient, because why not get everything in the moment? And I think that's why I prefer like multi-camera shows as opposed to, you know, single camera stuff like that, because you're gonna get, and I always notice the bad reverses, especially when you can tell that the person speaking, like we're in 2 separate shots. I'm talking to you, and then we cut to your reaction. My mouth is moving, but it isn't matching up with my dialogue because it's not the same take. So I much prefer that kind of shoot it all, go through it, we'll watch it all and see how it looks, and then, all right, so we're gonna do a close-up, and this time get in there with the sword, or this time, you know, draw a little bit slower, or do something like that, and we'll put the pieces together, but we have the full blueprint of it. As an actor and as a filmmaker, that's how I prefer to do it. So it's nice to see, you know, one of the legends doing that as well. So you're like, well, I'm just doing what Kurosawa did. If you don't like it, that's on you, but he did it, and I think he's great, so I'm gonna just copy him.
It's also so intimidating when you watch a film like this, because, you know, and you get, like, when you read some of his biographies, or if you look him up and you see some of his quotes about how he did it and what he was watching and who he was influenced by, you get that it's a, you know, the way we're looking at Akira Kurosawa and saying, you know, wow, he invented this type of film, he was looking at somebody else and saying the same thing. But it's just so intimidating watching this, because it does feel like he was just sitting there and he just, I know exactly what to do, and I'm going to be the first one to do it, and I'm going to be completely influential. However, you know he didn't. You know this was just this is just the way I need to tell this story. And then he puts it out there, and people look at it and go, "Holy crap! You know, I've never seen anything like this."
And then he's just sitting there going, "Well, I'm glad you liked it." Not like, "I'm so good at this. I'm the best." And it's hard. It's very hard to get that perspective that, you know, you watch something like Gone with the Wind, Titanic, Star Wars, any of those like huge influential films where you're like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. And fast forward or rewind, you know, 18 months when they're in the middle of the woods and slugs are dropping down on them, and they're having to put salt all over their bodies because to keep the slugs off of them. And they're like, well, we don't have any light in here. And he's like, go to wardrobe and steal a bunch of their mirrors. And then they're like, does this work at all? And he's like, I don't know, we're filming it. And they just don't, and they don't know. And you don't have the perspective of the final product. And it's actually, we did a live podcast this past weekend, and Tim Bridge was telling a story of George Lucas talking to Ewan McGregor and saying, you know, oh, you got to be careful that you don't go too big, because, you know, it might be too much and people think you've gone too far. And this is a behind-the-scenes making of Phantom Menace. Cut to George Lucas has just watched the first screening of Phantom Menace, and he kind of says under his breath, oh, I think I may have gone too far in a few points. You don't have that perspective to say what we're doing in this moment will work or won't work. It's just, let's see if it works.
Get it done,
And, you know, you want to give the credit to guys like Akira Kurosawa that they had it all figured out and they had this, you know, final product in their mind. And he didn't know what it was going to look like until it was done. And then, even then, who's to say he didn't look at it and go, well, it's done, and it is what it is. So many things that I've made, my benchmark of it's done when I'm sick of watching it. Because it's like, I can't do anything else with it, I can't improve it in any way. There.
And I don't even know what I'm looking at anymore.
I hope everybody else likes it because I'm sick of it. And then people go, oh my God, that was so great. And you're like, oh, thank you. Or, I didn't like that one. You're like, yeah, me neither. Next one. And that's the sign of a good filmmaker too, that he didn't bank his entire career on Rashomon or Seven Samurai. He kept making films. He was a filmmaker, and he's like, I'm glad you liked it. I'm working on something else right now. And you see so many filmmakers like that now who hold on to their precious little darlings, and they're like, this is my movie that everybody loves. Don't you love it too?
Right.
And then 20 years later, they're still like, hey, remember my movie that you loved? And you're like, yeah, but that was 20 years ago. Haven't you made anything new? And then what he was making movies into his 80s or something, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
His last film was like in the
85?
85. That's insane. My dad's born in 54. I'm born in 84.
Mm-hmm.
So we made this before my dad was born, and he made his last film the year after I was born. And that was his entire career. God. You're a great filmmaker, Akira Kurosawa. Your name is hard to say.
Speaking of your podcast and Mr. Tim, because I've been listening to a lot of the past ones because I've been seeing all these new movies and all the new movies this year, and I go back because I didn't want to have it spoiled and listen to it, so I go back and I listen to it. He seems to like movies like this that take a cinematic idea and showcase it and use it in very innovative ways. It's just a random thought that I had while listening to
I think that's because he's still in film school mindset of everything has to follow the formula. Everything has to be the way that the filmmaker is intended and the great classics and all of these things. And it's like, okay, you can also just like watching a movie.
Right. But I think like he would be like I know he loved Lady Bird, and I did too, but as opposed to a film like that is just very simply a film about humans, he would tend to, I think he would be more enthusiastic about a film that is very cinematic and very, I don't want to say gimmicky, but I mean that uses the tools of cinema in a more visual way.
Well, that's Tim Bridge.
I know.
And nobody likes him.
Oh, everyone likes Tim.
He is Vermont's funniest comedian. Final thoughts on Rashomon.
Just that, man. I mean, you watch it. I grabbed these books from VCAM's library on purpose because, you get cinematography, art direction, editing, and screenplay. And this film just uses all of those elements, all the cinematic elements in the toolbox, in just a complete, concise, innovative way. And I think, for those people who maybe don't like watching foreign cinema or have problems with it or have problems with old films, there are those films that you pop in and all of a sudden you're just like, oh my God, I had no idea it was this. And I think a lot of people, like to your point, would ask, what is Rashomon about? Like, what is it? And then you watch it and you're like, wow, it's this.
And you may take something else from it. That's the other thing that's great about it. I take from it that it's a search for truth in a true crime story. What do you take from it?
It's hard because when you were saying that, I'm like, wow, I don't think of it as a crime film, but what else could it be? To me, it's it's a poetic cinematic film about humanity.
Yeah. See, we watched the same movie, and we got a completely different experience out of it. That's fascinating. Someday, I will get film struck, and someday I will watch his catalog. Until then, anytime that you put one of these on the schedule for me, I'm so excited. Because, like I said, growing up in Northeast Colorado with a video store inside a Radio Shack, you're not going to get a lot of Akira Kurosawa.
Filmstruck, Criterion Channel, search. Akira Kurosawa. I mean, really? I mean, it's so good. I mean, I Live in Fear, The Lower Depths, Throne of Blood, The Hidden Fortress, The Bad Sleep Well, which is a crime film. Really awesome. Yojimbo, Sanjuro, High and Low, another crime film. Redbeard, talked about. He has a movie called Stray. Is it Stray Cat or Stray Dog? About a police officer who loses his gun and has to go through the underdepths of the crime world to find it.
Oh boy.
And it is amazing. And the
I think somebody remade that. That sounds so familiar.
So Magnolia, Paul Thomas Anderson.
Yeah.
John C. Reilly's character at some point, because he's a cop, he loses his gun, and it was a total rip from that. But Paul Thomas Anderson has talked about this too. Is like it's so great because the first shot of the film is a close up of the character just saying, "I lost my gun," and then the movie's just boom.
Who needs exposition?
Awesome.
Oh. Birthday present. Filmstruck channel movies. Okay. Rashomon, 1950. Great choice. Thank you for putting it on the schedule. Where to watch? You can find it on iTunes and Amazon for $4. You can find it on Filmstruck if you subscribe to Filmstruck. Next week, we're going to be doing The Last Picture Show.
Yes.
Our guest will be my lovely wife, Rachel Riando. And I don't know anything about Last Picture Show.
Oh my God, very excited. So Peter Bogdanovich, speaking of Lady Bird, excellent coming-of-age film. I think Last Picture Show is my favorite coming-of-age, my favorite film about teenagers. And it's just watch. It's amazing.
All I know is Jeff Bridges, isn't it?
Yes, he is.
A young Jeff Bridges.
Jeff Bridges, one of his first movies.
Which is going to be weird, because Jeff Bridges is the dude. That's it.
He's excellent in it, too.
I can't wait. Well, thank you, David. And thank you all.
Thank you.
For watching and for listening out there. And just to reiterate our change in program schedule, Facebook and YouTube will be the week after we record, and VCAM Channel 15 will be 2 weeks after we record. So sorry for that confusion. It's just what it is. All right. So until next time, I'm Lincoln L. Hayes.
I'm David Metzger.
See ya.